पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu. Sarve santu niramayaha. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. Ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. Sarvastaratu durgani. Sarvo bhadrani pashyatu. Sarvas satbuddhimapnotu. Sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato ma Satkamaya Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Today we'll take a look at a set of verses in chapter 9. There is so much to reflect on every verse in this great book, Gita. A lot of times we find that you read a certain verse and reflect on it, and certain ideas come up and you try to arrange them in your mind and try to make sense, try to place it in the larger worldview that we have. And then next time you read those same verses again, some newer ideas or some deeper ideas come. And then we have to kind of rearrange the picture in our mind once again. And that is the beauty and the value of a scripture like the Gita. There is so much depth, there is so much meaning behind every verse that at any time we can dip into any of these verses and we will be able to go as deep as our mind will allow us to go at that point. And maybe at some other time, when our mind is more lucid, more calm, more mature, we might be able to go to greater depths and then discover the meaning hidden at that deeper layers. And that's why the study of the Gita never ends with just one reading. We have to keep on reading over and over and over again with the idea that eventually we will be able to find or have a more deeper understanding of the text. The idea is when we change, our mind changes and what we can get out of the book also changes. That is, I may have mentioned this before, those people who make it a habit to study the Gita from beginning to end, or recite the Gita, or study it, whichever way, once they reach the last chapter of the last verse, they don't end the reading or chanting for that day with the last verse of the last Gita, of the last chapter of the last verse of the last chapter. What they do is once they reach that last verse of the last chapter, they go back to the first verse of the first chapter and read it and then end their reading for that day. The idea is the Gita is not finished, that I plan to read it over again. That kind of an affirmation is done by not concluding it with the last verse of the book. So today I want to draw your attention to this set of verses in chapter 9, beginning with verse number 7. So let me read verse 7 to you right now, 7 and 8. Sarvabhutani kaunteya prakritim yanti mamikam kalpakshaye punastani kalpatau visrujamyaham prakritim swam avashtabhya visrujami punah punah bhutagramamimam kritsnam avasham prakritir vashat. At the end of a kalpa, O son of Kunti, all beings go back to my Prakriti. At the beginning of another kalpa, I send them forth again. Animating my Prakriti, I project again and again this whole multitude of beings helpless under the sway of Prakriti. In chapter 8, which we saw a couple of weeks ago, we saw there was a discussion about death, about how we die. When we die, what exactly happens? How the thoughts we have at the moment of death influence our journey after death, and so on. So what is being discussed here is not simply the individual death, but what happens when this whole universe as we understand it, when it disappears, when it dies. We know that every material entity undergoes all this transformation. Transformation, there is degeneration and eventually decomposition. Things returning back to their constituent elements. So just as the body, which is made up of atoms and molecules, all material particles, when the force that holds these particles together is dissipated, then these particles will return back to the elements, and that is what we call death. Now, what about the material particles constituting this entire universe? Will that ever go back to its constituent elements? And that is being referred to here. When that happens, it is called the end of a kalpa, a cycle, a creation. So creation is not a one-time event as described in the Gita. It is something that happens over and over and over again. We have seen in earlier chapters 3, 4, and so on, there's a discussion about yajna. We saw how most of the cosmic processes are cyclical. It does go. There's a day followed by night, followed by day, followed by night. Similarly, season, there is a cycle of seasons. One season follows another. It's again very cyclical. So similarly, creation is not seen as a one-time event. That there is creation, this whole material universe comes into being, it remains for a while, it's sustained, it's maintained by these cosmic processes, and that which has a beginning also has an end. So it began at one point and then it's going to end again. So now that end is not like the ultimate end. So that end is kind of like going to sleep. It's like death. It's like the distinction between sleep and death. We make a distinction between sleep, actually, come to think of it. We don't have to, but we do. So why do we make a distinction? Because when we are asleep, it's not really death, but to a large part, we are unconscious of the world. The body is lying almost motionless, but still breathing, but just lying there. The mind is not in contact with the external world. It does its own projections, which is what dreams are. Then in the state of deep sleep, the mind also becomes almost non-functional. So it is a kind of a death, you could say. But it's not really death because next morning we wake up again. So similarly, you could say that the universe doesn't die, but it goes to sleep. And it goes to sleep means it almost going back. That's what is really referred to here. Kalpakshaya, that is going back, the end of the cycle. And then in verse 8, Krishna says, this universe which has kind of gone to sleep is animated back again by animating my Prakriti, I project it again and again. So this divine being, this principle of consciousness is what projects this universe again. So a few things that need to be kept in mind here. There is this death at different levels, we could say. For instance, in our body, there are billions and trillions of cells. And these cells are dying, these cells are changing, these cells are getting transformed. In fact, a lot of the COVID discussion cells around how this virus, this protein molecule goes inside, penetrates the cells, and how it just messes up the inside. So, and cells in our body are dying. They are continually dying and new cells are being created. So that process of birth and death is occurring at the cellular level constantly. And yet, we don't cry, we don't mourn the death of the cells because, and this is important, my sense of I, my ego, encompasses these billions and trillions of cells and considers it as one organism, one being. So my I is really an I which includes all the cells, and every cell is a living entity. Now, there is no way for us to know whether every cell has its own I sense, whether every cell has its own ego. We don't know. It might well have an ego. We don't know. But we do know that all these collections of cells together has this one. So in some sense, if the cell is a microcosm, my body is a macrocosm compared to the cell. If this analogy makes sense up to this point, then similarly we could say my I right now, all this collection of cells or these atoms and molecules, if you like, is also one tiny cell in this cosmic body of the universe. So I have my little I. We don't know if every cell has an I. It's possible to imagine that this whole universe taken as a one entity might have some I. There is some cosmic I identifying with this entire material creation, just like there is this ego of mine identifying with this world of a multitude of cells. So just as when I go to sleep, this kind of becomes non-functional. So when this big I, cosmic I, when that cosmic I goes to sleep, this whole material universe could be imagined to become non-functional as well. And that's what going to sleep means. That's what the end of a cycle means. So sometimes there are calculations given, not to be taken too literally in some books about Brahma, the creative aspect of the divine. What is a Brahma's day and what is a Brahma's night? So sometimes they consider that Brahma, the creative aspect, the creative force which makes this material universe possible, when that creative force goes to sleep, that is the end of the kalpa. And when Brahma wakes up, this whole universe is rejuvenated again. That is what is meant by saying, I project it again and again. Exactly in the same way as I project this world when I wake up in the morning. So I could say, again, have a little bit of imagination, and it is this, that this world that I am experiencing now, when I go to sleep, we could either think that this world is going on out there while I'm asleep, and that's what most people think. But another way of looking at that is that when I go to sleep, all of this universe, which is as if projected through my senses, is then withdrawn back into me. And then when I wake up in the morning, that which was lying in a latent form within me is projected out again. So it's possible to see that we are creating our world every morning we wake up, and we absorb that world into ourselves when we go to sleep. Just as I project the dream world when I am asleep, and then that whatever is projected is again withdrawn back when I wake up again. So that's a way of understanding, way of looking. Now, what is interesting here is when Krishna says, I project it again and again, animating my Prakriti. Now, Prakriti or nature or the material universe is seen as it's material. It's not, it cannot be animated by itself. It needs consciousness for it to be animated. So it's the proximity with consciousness is very important. Without that proximity, the universe itself cannot function. And we have seen this on earlier occasions as well. Right now, the body and mind appear to be conscious entities. The Gita philosophy is that consciousness, right now, my body is conscious, my mind is conscious, that consciousness does not belong to the body, does not belong to the mind. But that consciousness belongs to the true self, the Atman. Now, the Atman proximity to the body and mind makes the body and mind seem as if they are conscious. The classical example given in books is that if you hold a hibiscus flower, a red flower, let's say, near a prism or a piece of glass, then, and you look at that glass, now the glass will appear red, of course, because the flower is there near it. It might seem as if that redness of that glass belongs to that glass, piece of glass or that prism. But we know it belongs to the flower. But just because the flower is close to that piece of glass or that prism, the prism appears red, although the redness doesn't belong to it. Exactly in the same way, the Atman, which is pure consciousness, that is so close to the body and mind that the body and mind appear conscious. It is so close that the body and mind begin to see themselves as if they are conscious. They forget that consciousness doesn't belong to them. Sri Ramakrishna gives the example, you must have read it in that his conversation, the Kathamrita or the Gospel of Ramakrishna. He gives the example about when we are cooking vegetables. And so let's say you have some potatoes and whatever other vegetables you're cooking, you put them in water and you start heating it. After some time, when the water starts boiling, the potatoes, along with the water, the potatoes will start moving inside. If the bubbles start coming and the vegetable starts jumping. Now, Sri Ramakrishna says, some of these, if you kind of, again, have a little creative imagination, if these vegetables may be saying to themselves, look how active I am, how much I'm jumping about. And but the real, what makes these potatoes jump in the water is nothing intrinsic in the potato itself, but it's the fire below. The fire itself is not in direct contact with the potatoes. But because of that fire, the potatoes jump. And it would be wrong for the potatoes to think that they have this ability in themselves to jump about or to move. Exactly in the same way, the body and mind, if they are deluded, they would think that I have this ability, that I'm a conscious entity. And the Gita says, no, that consciousness really belongs to the Atma. And that's what is meant by saying, animating my Prakriti, I project again and again this whole multitude of beings helpless under the sway of Prakriti. So now those entities, they don't have a freedom of their own. They are under the sway of this conscious being. Again, think about it this way. My hand cannot do whatever it wants. Now, if I want to lift this piece of wood, I have to will it. And then this hand will go and do what needs to be done. Every part of that activity is willed by me. We know that sometimes when our limbs start moving without us having any control over them, then that's a problem. It's not considered to be a normal state of things. So similarly, everything that is moving, there is some big cosmic eye that is controlling it. And that cosmic eye is often seen as this big Parameshwara, the personal God, the divine being who is presiding over this entire universe. Look at verse number 9. Nachamam tani karmani nibadhanti dhananjaya udasinavadasinam asaktam teshu karmasu. These acts do not bind me, sitting as one neutral, unattached to them, O Dhananjaya. So all these beings in the universe, all these individual living creatures in the universe, whatever they are doing, whatever they are being made to do is a result of their karma. But the one who is presiding over this, that entity is not affected by the karma. Again, bringing it back to home, if at all, again, you just imagine, if at all every little cell, since every cell in our body is a living entity, we have no way of denying or confirming whether each cell has its own karma. Again, if each cell has a sense of agency and experience, again, we do not know whether they have either of them. If they do, then they have their karma. Now, we are not directly affected by the karma because we have this collection of this. So every cell dying doesn't cause grief to us because we are not identified with just one cell. We are identified with this entire thing. So similarly, this cosmic being who is identified with the whole universe is not affected by them. That is what is being said. That is why these acts do not bind me, because I sit as one neutral, unattached to them. So the Atman, the principle of consciousness, is not affected by whatever happens to the body and mind, which is why we say the body has birth and death. The Atman has neither. It's the mind, it goes back and forth between joy and sorrow. The Atman is beyond them both. So Atman is not affected by any of these things. Looking at it theistically, God is not affected. Now, it sometimes does raise questions, of course, because we often see God as someone who loves us. And then we therefore ask questions such as this: everyone is suffering. How could God allow all this? Now, behind this kind of questioning, why God would allow suffering in the world, or that God loves me, God is who God is. But this way of thinking about God reflects my need for love, that I need to love someone, that there is a need in me to be loved by someone. There is this need in me for someone to remove the difficulties and problems that I have in life. So it is this my need, my hope, that is being projected outwardly, and I project it on this cosmic being and then visualize and pray and adore that cosmic being in that way. Now we might say, well, if it is just my projection, is it just imagination? You cannot say it's imagination because it works. We do find in our life that when we pray, our prayers are answered. We do find that when there is suffering, yes, there is suffering, but then there is also ways by which that suffering can be removed or minimized. So just as there are acts which cause pain, there are also other acts which can help alleviate the pain. Now, a devotee of God, one who believes in a personal God, sees that as an act of God. That so much so that devotees say even if they go out and help someone and someone credits them and thanks them for it, the devotee knows in his heart that I could not have done what I did if it were not for the grace of God. That person got what they got because of God's grace, not because of me. Because once I start, well, I did it, then the ego gets in. When the ego gets in, then of course I'm cut off from that reality. That is the idea. Look at verse 10. Maya adhyakshena prakritihi suyate sacharacharam hetunanena kaunteya jagat viparivartate. By reason of my proximity, Prakriti produces all this, is what we saw. The moving and the unmoving, the world wheels round and round, O son of Kanti, because of this. We saw this, that because of the proximity of the divine. Now, because the divine is close, as I said already, we make the mistake of thinking that we ourselves have that principle of consciousness. That is what is said here in the verse 11. Avajananti mam mudha manushim tanumashritam param bhavamajananto mama bhuta maheshwaram. Unaware of my higher state, as the great Lord of beings, fools disregard me, dwelling in the human form. And because of that proximity, we forget, just like potatoes forget that is the fire that is giving them that movement. They think it's them, they themselves. Similarly, we think that whatever accomplishments we have in life, whatever we achieve in life, is because I did it. And everyone says, well, if it's something good, we all say, I did it. And if it's something not good, then we start either finding excuses or blaming it on someone else. Well, that's just human nature. What Krishna is pointing out here is that everything happens through God's will. But what we do make the mistake of sometimes thinking that even the divine being is considered as a human being. And we've seen that. All these great ones who periodically come down on the earth, whom we worship as saviors or prophets or incarnations, not everyone was able to recognize them for who they were. Some people did, and thank goodness they did that, because of them, the rest of us who may not have had a chance to meet these great ones personally, but because of there were few people who recognized them, that the rest of us who came later were able to get inspired and learn from them. But there were many during their lifetime who did not. Now we are right in the Christmas season, and we are going to celebrate on Christmas Eve and Christmas. We know that even when the divine came in the form of Jesus, the great descent of the divine, the Son of God who came to help the world, how many people could recognize him? Today, a lot more. A big chunk of humanity recognizes him as a descent of the divine. that there was some extraordinary being, an extraordinary power came in his form. But we do know that during his earthly stay, when he came down as if in a human form, not everyone could recognize him. How would it have been possible to crucify the body in which Jesus came if everyone had seen him as a divine being, if they had seen him as a savior? But many didn't, which is why he was crucified. Not he, his body. Similarly, we see in the lives of many others as well. In the life of the Buddha, Prophet Muhammad, they had great following, but there were also people who were skeptical of who they were. Not everyone could recognize them. In the case of Ramakrishna, we know that, again, many during his time saw him as a some saw him as a good person. Some people saw him as a little bit crazy person. Some people just saw him as just a person who was an God-intoxicated person. But there were many, as I said, who saw him as a priest in a temple, and nothing beyond that. So that is what Krishna is referring to here, unaware of my higher state. Now, just as it is possible to apply this to the lives of the incarnation prophets and saints, we can also apply this to the Atman, that avajananti mam mudha. We have seen that oftentimes, whenever the first person pronoun is used in the Gita, that can refer to the Atman. So, avajananti mam mudha, unaware of my higher state. So what happens is the Atman within us, we disregard it. We don't acknowledge his presence. And instead of that, our disregarding of the Atman within, not acknowledging that it is there, ignoring it, and just focusing only on the body and mind, is in a way, metaphorically, crucifying the Atman. Well, you cannot really. Just like Jesus could not be crucified. What they could do at the most was do that to the body, but not to Jesus. So similarly, the Atman cannot be, even to not acknowledge the Atman, even to disregard the Atman, you need the Atman. You need the proximity with consciousness. Because when we are unconscious, in deep sleep, we cannot disregard the Atman because we are not just conscious of it. So even in order to disregard it, we need consciousness. So who are these people who disregard the higher truth, either within or these great beings who come to us as incarnation prophets and saviors? That is described in verse 12 really. Look at it. Moghasha moghakarmano moghajnana vichetasah rakshasim asurim chaiva prakritim mohinim shritaha. Of vain hopes, of vain works, of vain knowledge, and senseless, they verily are possessed of the delusive nature of Rakshasas and Asuras. Now, in Indian mythology, there is oftentimes a lot of description about these different demons. We saw a few weeks ago when we studied the Chandi or the Devi Mahatmyam, the number of Asuras and Rakshasas that the goddess slays and kills. And in popular mythology, these Rakshasas are often depicted with some kind of very fierce features. Even just the appearance of a Rakshasa can be terrifying. And just by looking at that, we know, oh, this person is a Rakshasa, this is an Asura. But that's only a way it gets depicted visually. or in mythology. It's perfectly possible that these asuras and rakshasas outwardly look like just normal beings. In fact, this thought came to me also some years ago when, after 9/11, when they were finally able to find these the people who had hijacked the planes and then blown it up. And they had these pictures of some of these uh, hijackers as they were passing through the security cameras at the airport. And it was shocking because they just looked like just normal human beings. No one, I mean, just imagine if those hijackers or terrorists, they really looked like Rakshasas. It would have been very easy to identify them. They wouldn't have been able to pass through the security at all. But they just looked like just normal human beings. And how much destruction, what violence, how much suffering, how much pain they caused. There's no end to it. So these Rakshasas and Asuras, it's not so much about the external appearance. Outwardly, a person can look sometimes even very saintly, but that person might be a big Asura inside. And what are the characteristics of a real Asura, irrespective of how that person looks externally? That is described here. Vain hopes, vain works, vain knowledge, vain senseless. What does the word vain mean? That means those who disregard the higher truth, disregard God, if you're looking at it theistically, or disregard the spirit within. Let's look at them one by one. Mogha asha, expectation. So, all of us have a lot of hopes, a lot of expectations. Now, if all of my hopes and expectations are centered around things that have nothing to do with the spiritual reality or nothing to do with God, that's a characteristic of a Rakshasa. So it's time for some soul searching. How many of the hopes that I treasure, how many of the expectations that I have God as focus, or as the spirit, or my spiritual ideal as the focus? Because all other hopes connected with all material things is a characteristics of a Rakshasa. Similarly, vain works, all the activities I'm engaged in, how many of my activities are directly or indirectly connected with my spiritual ideal? Why do I say indirectly? I say indirectly because a lot of the work that I do may not look very spiritual at all. For instance, just vacuuming your house, just vacuuming your room. We'll say, well, how can I say that that work is connected with God? But while I'm doing it, if at least in some corner of my mind is the thought that God dwells in my home, I want my home to be clean so that when God walks into every room of my home, it will be a pleasant place for God to dwell in. If this thought comes at least once when I am vacuuming, then we say, well, that activity is not entirely vain. Otherwise, that activity is vain. Similarly, if you are cooking, now, while I'm cooking, if a devotee says that I'm primarily cooking out of love for God, that before I eat, I'm primarily cooking it for God, I will offer it to the divine, and then I will eat it, then even that activity of cooking becomes spiritual, indirectly connected with spirituality. But we might say when I do meditation and worship and prayer, those things seem to be visibly, clearly connected with divine. But even every other activity, whatever other job that people may be doing, even though externally it may not seem to be very spiritual, externally many of these activities may look very secular. But again, it's just how you look at it. If a devotee says that whatever knowledge, skill, and talent and time that God has given me, I'm using all these great blessings I have received from God in doing this work. And whatever I get paid for this work, I will use it for the maintenance of the body, of course, because, well, without the body and mind, how can I even continue my spiritual practice? But then after fulfilling my own personal needs, I will use whatever excess I have for a good purpose, to help someone, to somehow remove pain and suffering. Not necessarily only of strangers, but one's own family, one's own friends, one's own neighbors. And if I still have something more, to then give it even to people I don't know. So using the things that I earn, even from my secular livelihood, if I do it as an offering to the divine in a spirit of karma yoga, then that activity doesn't become vain. Even though, as I said, externally it might look very secular or vain knowledge. Now we get a lot of knowledge in this world, depending on whatever our specialty is. But even knowledge, if I connect it directly or indirectly with my spiritual ideal, then that knowledge is not vain. If I look upon any knowledge that takes me away from myself, my true self, any knowledge that takes me away from God, that knowledge is not going to help. But anything that will help bring about greater clarity to my mind, bring about better ability for me to serve people around me, or to have a greater understanding of myself, my purpose in life, all of that knowledge is very helpful. And then says senseless and of delusive nature. So when all of these qualities, to the extent these qualities are present in me, there is something of that Rakshasa and Asura present in me as well. So don't only think that the Rakshasas or Asuras were these ancient beings. Ravana was an Asura, and all these great demons that Krishna killed, and that this was only possible in olden days. I think Asuras are present even now. And as I said, they are a little bit more difficult to find now because externally they look like just ordinary human beings. And one of the Asuras may be the one I see when I stand before a mirror. Actually, I don't even need to look at the mirror. I just need to look in my own heart to find out, in a very brief way, the characteristics given here. We don't have to feel very disappointed or go into denial if we find that some of these asuric or Rakshasa tendencies are there in my heart. With spiritual life is meant for that. Spiritual life is nothing but a daily grind, a daily persistence with sincerity, with patience, to destroy this Asura, destroy the Rakshasa within. Because the more I destroy that Asura within, the more the divine will shine forth. And that divine is described in the very next verse, verse 13. Mahatmanastu mam partha daivim prakritimashritah bhajantyananya manaso jnatva bhutadim avyayam. But the great souled ones, O son of Pritha, possessed of the divine Prakriti, knowing me to be the origin of beings and immutable, worship me with single mind. Verse 14. Satatam kirtayanto mam yatantascha dridhavrataha namasyantascha mam bhaktya nityayukta upasate. Glorifying me always and striving with firm resolve, bowing down to me in devotion, always steadfast, they worship me. Again, just as the characteristics of the asuras were given in verses 11 and 12, 13 and 14 give the characteristic of one who has these divine qualities. So, if any time we have a doubt about how I should live, what I should do, this set of 4 verses can be very helpful. So the choices I make in life, the decisions I take in life should be such that either it'll destroy or weaken the Rakshasa in my heart, or it'll strengthen the divine in my heart. So this Daivi Sampat, this divine nature. So both are present in us. Right now, we are a mixture. There are a lot of good qualities in our heart. There are a lot of negative tendencies in our heart as well. And spiritual life, when Swami Brahmanandaji described spiritual life as a struggle, as a constant struggle, and the struggle involves simply this: day after day after day, without getting exhausted, without getting discouraged, without giving up hope. Day after day after day, every morning I wake up and say, today I'm going to destroy a little bit of the asura in me. And today I'm going to strengthen the little bit of the divine in me. So one is an act of destruction, the other is an act of construction. That's how essentially how it is. It's a little bit like road repair. We get up and say, well, there are potholes, they need to be filled. And there are other portions which are well maintained, we need to preserve it. So strengthen the weakened parts and then repair the negative parts. That's essentially what spiritual life is. Sometimes when we think, oh, I would like to be spiritual, but I don't know what to do, these 4 verses tell us, in a very nutshell, they tell us what we need to do. Find ways to eliminate the negativities in our heart and find ways to strengthen the strengths within us. And every one of us, none of us can say there are only negative things in me. And none of us, I would think, can say that I have only good qualities. Most of us are a mixture of the two. And so day after day after day, we need to work to strengthen the good qualities within us and remove the negativities within us. That's the way to go forward. So we will stop here now. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and if you have any comments, questions, thoughts, please share them, and then we can take a look after 5 minutes. Okay? Let's look at the questions. Kalpa, is this etymologically connected to Kalpana, Brahman's fantasy that creates the world? I don't know. I don't know if there are any Sanskritists among you. Please take a look, and then maybe next time you can let us all know. But I'm not sure whether Kalpa is connected with Kalpana. In an absolute sense, Rakshasa and Asuras are a manifestation and nothing but Brahman. So is this shloka invoking Viveka to discern between real and unreal and hold on to real? Yes, we could say that. But also, Viveka is not simply between real and unreal. Viveka is also between the good and the bad, the positive and the negative. So applying Viveka, we can look in our own heart, find the positive things there, also find the negative things there. And then, as I said, whatever we do, whatever we think, the goal is to eliminate the negative, the weakening aspects within us, and to strengthen the positive within the aspects within us. Next question. Is being more selfish means more asura, while being more unselfish means more divine? Yes, you could say that. As long as selfishness is present in our heart, an asura is present in some form, in some way. And unselfishness, that is why sometimes they say unselfishness is divine. There's one point that I have oftentimes made in the past and which I would like to repeat. It's better to try to focus on removing selfishness from our heart, not so much on becoming unselfish. I say this because being unselfish is our own nature. There is nothing much needs to be done in order to be unselfish. If I remove selfishness from the heart, what remains is unselfishness. On the other hand, if I want to become unselfish, what it usually ends up doing is creating one mask of an unselfish identity. And so we don't have to do that because the idea is not to put on masks. The idea is to remove all masks. So if I can remove selfishness from my heart, unselfishness is all that remains. It's just like love and hatred. I have to remove hatred from my heart. I don't necessarily have to put too much energy in being loving, becoming loving. Because if I succeed in removing hatred from my heart, love is all that will automatically remain because love is already there within us. On the other hand, if I have certain fixed ideas about what it means to be loving, then I will focus more on external activities or my words or my expressions which will give the appearance of being a loving person. So I'm really putting on one more persona of being a loving being. So it's more helpful to try to focus on removing hatred in order to be loving, removing selfishness in order to be unselfish. Next question. When Lord Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," was he referring to the Atman in the Gita? That might well be the way a Vedanta student understands it. In Christian theology, there may be other ways of understanding the statement, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." But when a student of the Gita reads that, This certainly is one way of referring, that the reference is to the Atman in our own heart. Next question. Sometimes when we know the right from wrong, guilt occurs when anger or lower nature takes over the divine in us. How do we overcome this guilt in a spiritual manner and not go into a self-loathing way? Good question. The way to overcome the guilt is not to somehow find a way to run away from being guilty. I think there is a healthy way to feel guilty. Because if I feel guilty, then that is going to produce some pain in the heart. And then, so long as I make sure that that pain makes me undertake a positive response. In other words, if there is something that I feel guilty about, then if I make a firm resolve that whatever it is that produced that guilt, going forward in my life, I will not repeat the same mistake again. I will not make the same error again. So when that true repentance and then seek divine help and divine forgiveness, that kind of a response is a positive response to any feeling of guilt, rather than finding ways to just paper over it or to just hide it. Sometimes people tend to do that. Oh, I'm just feeling bad about it, and then give me something by which I will feel good again. But there are these temporary ways of feeling good. A lot of addictions that occur are just ways of feeling good. But that feeling good never lasts for long. It's a very temporary solution. And so if there is some pain and suffering within, we have to find out ways of harvesting that pain so that I go to the root of it, find a way out of it in such a manner that I don't create the same mistake again. And if I don't make the same mistake again, I prevent that pain and suffering from visiting me again. So what we need are more lasting solutions, not just a temporary way to get out of, not quick fixes, I mean. Yeah. Next question. When the Atman is operating the inert body and mind, who is acquiring the samskaras that lead to next birth? The Atman is operating the inert body and mind, that's true, but it's the Atman which is identified with the body and mind. And so the jiva, when we say a jivatma or a jiva or the individual self, the jiva who is deluded in the sense that the Atman who has forgotten that I am infinite, I am the only existence in this world, and I have become identified with just one body and mind. So this deluded Atman, along with the body and mind, is what goes from one life to the next life. And because of the proximity with this Atman, it's the mind that stores these impressions, and it is these impressions then that are carried from one birth to the next. Next question. What is the seed of the Rakshasa or Asura tendencies within us? Or in other words, where do they come from? If we must use the phrase original sin, again in a completely different way than how it is used in Judeo-Christian thought, the original sin, in other words, the basic problem in Vedanta is really ignorance, self-forgetfulness, the Atman forgetting that it is the Atman. So that is the seed, because once I forget that I am eternal, I've already made myself small. Once I forget that I'm immortal, I've already made myself a very mortal creature. Once I forget that I'm the source of all purity, I'm purity itself, I've already made myself impure in some form. And so the ignorance is what starts this whole downward spiral. And eventually you have these asuras and the rakshasas coming over. So the ultimate solution for killing the rakshasa once and for all, when that rakshasa will never come up again, is to get the knowledge of Brahman. We know from the story of the Devi, there was this one of the asuras, some of you might remember when we studied it a few weeks ago, who every drop of blood that came out of the body of that asura produced a clone of that asura, an equivalent asura. And sometimes that is what happens. Just a little seed of negativity in our heart, if we don't try to take it out, if we don't try to remove it, then that one little thing will spawn 100 other things. And that's why you will see, and this as much true with good things as well. If there is a seed of goodness within us, and we water that seed and take good care of it, then lot of good tendencies come. If we water the wrong seeds, then a lot of negative tendencies come. It's a little like watering in the garden. If I water the plants, the beautiful flowering plants, beautiful flowers will come. But if I'm not able to distinguish between which is a good plant and which are just weeds, wild weeds, and I start watering them instead, then these weeds will grow in my garden. So my garden is capable of producing both weeds as well as these beautiful flowers. The question is, what do I water? What do I remove? In my ignorance, if I remove the good plants and keep the weeds, I am the loser. But if I use my discernment and say, no, this is good, I'm going to keep this, I'm going to remove all the weeds, then my garden becomes a beautiful place. So similarly, our mind is like the garden. There are these good samskaras, there are bad samskaras. Like an expert gardener, if I look carefully and I'm able to distinguish between good and bad seeds in my own heart, then I can carefully, with patience, it may not happen overnight. It's not just a 1 week project. It could take, we don't know how long. But with patience, with faith, if I continue one by one removing these negativities and watering these positive seeds within us, very quickly the garden in my mind will become a beautiful place. It's a place so beautiful that I would like to visit it again and again. I would then want to meditate more and more. Why is it that sometimes meditation becomes a chore? Because this garden is a terrible place. I don't want to be in this garden, and therefore I run out. But if this garden of my mind becomes beautiful, fragrant, then I would want to visit it and spend more and more time in my heart. Next question. At some level, how could positive exist if there were no negatives? This is in reference to the positive and negative qualities, like enjoying the air conditioning in summer and the heater in winter. Yes, it's true. The terms positive and negative are opposite polarities, and they exist in relation to one another. And that is why what is said in the Gita and other texts is that I can try to remove the negatives as much as I can. Right now, it's easy to distinguish between the two because both are present. But once I'm able to remove the negatives and that which is positive is seen, after the negatives are gone, we don't have to call them by the name positives, but they're still there because I haven't removed it. And there is no need to remove them, but only when the positives remain, I'm able to transcend them. So the truth itself, the higher reality, is beyond the positive and negative, is beyond good and bad. But in order to reach that reality, first I have to remove the bad, remove the negative, and then transcend the positive, transcend the good. Next question. Can we say that a worldly, materialistic person is a combination of asuras and divine qualities? Indeed, we can and we should. I think that's a good way to look at it. How can one cultivate good qualities while living with selfish and devastating things happening around? I don't think this is that difficult. We have to work. I mean, right now, with the coronavirus going around everywhere, most of us are doing our best, and many of us, most of us really, are succeeding. Although the virus is really causing havoc in most parts of the world, and nowhere as much as it is in the United States, still, it's not that a majority of the population in any country has been infected with the virus. Yes, a lot of damage, but numerically, majority of the people are still free from it. Yes, we have to put our masks, we have to do social distancing, all that, yes. So even when the virus going around, I am still, with precautions, I'm able to keep myself free from it. Similarly, with all the selfish and devastating things, as you ask in this question, with all those things going around, that's also kind of a virus. And a different kind of a mask, a different kind of a psychological distancing, if you like. Yeah, we have to have different ways of dealing with these other virus. So it is definitely possible to do. Next question. How to forget or deal with the adverse impact caused as a result of asuric actions of others? Bad memories sometimes become a hurdle in spiritual practice. That is very true. Haunted by painful memories is a problem. Not only in spiritual life, just in even in secular life. It affects people, get stressed out, people are not able to sleep. Depending on how much stress there is, it can cause other kinds of illnesses as well. People who have a spiritual background, people who are take recourse to spiritual practices such as prayer, meditation, study of texts, who turn to God for help, are better able to deal with the asuric tendencies of others. We need protection, we need support. We can try to protect ourselves as much as possible, but sometimes the outward impact can be so strong that we do need help. Now, many of us try to take help of the supports that are already present in the world, our family, our friends, and so on. But there is also a much bigger, a much surer support already available in the form of God. So those who have devoted to God, those who have faith in God, are able to deal with this in a better way, I believe, than those who don't have that support. Next question. I get so confused with this cosmic I and me I. What about this? World exists only when we open our eyes. When we close, it's not there. Is the creation only in our consciousness? That is certainly one way of thinking. For some people, that way of thinking comes naturally. It's not only intellectually, not only does it make sense intellectually, but many people find that way of thinking helpful. That it is called Drishti Srishti Vada, that things exist as long as I'm aware of it. Just like my dream exists, my dream world exists as long as I'm aware of my dream. When I wake up, the dream world vanishes. Similarly, this world exists as long as I'm aware of it. Now, not everybody feels comfortable with this way of thinking, and therefore there is this other way of thinking. It's called sometimes called Drishti Srishtivada. That is, the world is there and I see it, and then there are other ways of dealing with that. So people are different. Some people think in one way, some people think in different way, and whichever way the mind thinks, it will try to find the explanation based on its orientation toward that reality. Next question. If consciousness pervades everything, how can reflecting surface reflect colors as in the crystal example? I'm not very clear with this question. As much as I can understand what the intent of the question is, that why, if consciousness pervades everything, why cannot consciousness be reflected equally? Because certainly we do make distinction between living beings and non-living beings. We make distinction between living creatures and chairs and tables and material objects like that. And then we have this category of plants which we feel are living, but they are living in a not in the way that human beings are. So this distinction occurs not because the consciousness itself is different, but the reflecting medium is different. Just as there used to be this hall of mirrors. Sometimes some of you might be familiar, I may be called by different names, I guess, but they have these mirrors of different, some are convex, some are concave, some are curved. And then if you go and stand before it, and then you will have the reflections would look very different. And that's not because the person is different, but the reflecting medium is different. And we could say that every object in this world, living or non-living, or an animal, plant, or just material objects, those are reflecting mediums. And therefore the consciousness, although it is all pervading, the consciousness is not reflected equally in all of them. That's how I see it, and I imagine that was probably the intent behind this question. So we come to the end of this questions today. So this will be our last Gita reflection on 24th, that is Thursday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. I know that many of you are from different time zones. So 7 o'clock Eastern Time on 24th, we will have the Christmas Eve celebration. And this time we will do it online as we are doing the Gita, except the Gita talks are being made available over live stream. You know the link already, but the Christmas Eve celebration will be over Zoom. So the Zoom links will be sent to all of you, those of you who are on the mailing list of the Vedanta Society. So if you get the daily quotes of Swami Vivekananda, then that means you are on the mailing list. But if you don't get those quotes, then it means that you are not on that list. So if you would like to be on that list, please go to our website, vedantasociety.net, and sign up. If you sign up, then you will be on the list, and then you will automatically get the Zoom link on 24th morning. We'll have another Zoom celebration on the 1st of January, the Kalpataru day as well, and that Zoom link also will be sent to you on the first morning. And then on 3rd of January, that's a Sunday, we will have a Holy Mother's Puja to celebrate Sharda Devi's birthday, which comes according to the lunar calendar on the 5th of January. But we will do the puja here on Sunday morning. And the puja will be on a live stream link just as you are watching it now. These are the upcoming programs. And the January after that will be closed for the winter recess. And the first Sunday in February, I believe it's the 7th of February, we'll have Swami Vivekananda Puja, his birthday. And then from the following Sunday after that, we will resume our Gita study. Hopefully by that time, many of us would have received the vaccine, and hopefully as days and weeks proceed, I hope and pray that most of us will be vaccinated. And then when things seem to reach some kind of normalcy, when people will feel safe to gather together again, then we will open it up. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. The tunnel did look pretty long, but I'm hoping and praying that through God's grace, and this beautiful hall, which always seems to be teeming with devotees and spiritual seekers, has been empty for too long. So I hope and pray that we all will meet together again and will be able to pray and meditate and reflect on these issues together. There's always a great joy in doing this kind of reflection, doing this meditation, doing prayer together as a group. And I hope that this will become possible before it's too long. So we will meet now next on the 24th evening at 7 o'clock for the Christmas Eve celebration. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.